FlexBox is the topic that most of people find it very complex when they first see it, as you probably did. But the truth is, it is not that hard as it seems to be. Today I want to break it down for you and show you the easiest way to learn it, because it is easy. Well, if you don't believe me, just sit back and watch. If you're eager to master web development and programming, this channel is tailor-made for you. If you enjoy what you see, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to this channel. So let's get started. Remember, when we say FlexBox, actually we are talking about two things: the flex items and a flex container. The flex items are our actual content, and the flex container will contain those items. By using CSS FlexBox, we can create complex and different layouts for our websites and different parts of our pages. As you can see here, I have a div with a class of container, and inside this div I have three other divs with a child class and also first, second, and third classes. Until right now, they have nothing to do with FlexBox, but we are about to change this container to a flex container instead of being a regular container. As you can see here inside my CSS code, I have my container div selected. For changing this container div to a FlexBox container, the only thing that we need to do is just set its display property to flex. And as you can see that it changed everything inside this container. Now this is a FlexBox container. You can see that now the items are in the same height. They are filling out all of the available space inside this container vertically, and also you can see that they are now in a row. They are beside each other instead of being in the top of each other. So this is the default things, and this is the biggest change that a flex container brings for us. So right now we can control these items inside this container, which are flexible items. Now they are flex items, and we can control and lay out them as we want by the properties that FlexBox offers for us. So now let's apply some properties for laying out these items. As you can see, they are sticking beside each other in a single row, and that's because the default direction for this container is a row, which means that the flex direction property is a row by default. We will see it in a second. So let me first talk about the flex direction property. So the flex direction property, it will specify the main structure of our FlexBox container. So whether we want to have a row-based container or a column-based container. Right now, by default, this is row-based. Therefore, you can see that the items are in a row. They are going horizontally. So if we have another item, it will be right here, and it will go like a row. So it will be horizontally. So if we, for example, change this to a column, you can see that now they are in the top of each other. The flex items are in the top of each other, and this is what a column is, right? So they are going vertically. So let's keep it a row. So this is the default value. If we don't specify this, it will be by default row, but I will just keep it for having some reference, because the next property that I want to talk about is dependent to this flex direction property. So now that we have our FlexBox and we have specified the flex direction, which we want to have a row-based direction, now for laying out these items inside this container, we have a bunch of properties. So this is the most confusing part of the CSS FlexBox, and I hope that I can simplify it for you as much as possible. And I promise that I will try my best. So the first property for laying out these items inside this container is justify content. And this justify content will justify our contents horizontally right now. So this is directly dependent on this flex direction property. So you can see that this flex direction is a row, which means that our items will go horizontally in a row. So this is what a row is, all right? This justify content will always align or arrange our items in the direction which this flex direction is. So right now our flex direction is row, so it will justify our content, or it will arrange our items based on a row. which means horizontally. For example, if I give it a center value, you can see that it centers our items horizontally because the flex direction is row and a row is going always horizontally. So if we add, for example, items, it will be horizontally added in this flex container. Or if I, for example, give it flex end, so it will be in the end of the flex box, which is right here. So I mean, this is justifying our content and justifying our items horizontally. Why horizontally? Because that is what the flex direction is. And the easiest way to remember this is that justify content will always arrange the items in the direction which the flex direction goes. Right now it is a row, so it will align our items in a row direction. And also we have different values for this justify content. For example, if we want to add spaces between these items and we want to separate them evenly by giving them evenly spaces between them, we can use the space between value, and you can see that it adds the remaining space in this container evenly between these items. So another value that we can give for this justify content is a space around, and that will add evenly some spaces around these individual items. And the both side of these items there will be some spaces. For example, if we write space around, you can see that it adds the leftover space evenly around these items individually. And also the last value that we can give for this justify content is space evenly, and it is just like space around, but it will add a little bit more space in the left and right side of this container. So this is justify content property, and let's keep it center, so it will be in the center. So now that we played with the layout of our items horizontally, now let's talk about the aligning items and laying out our items inside this container vertically, which means the opposite direction of this justify content. So that is the align items property. This align items property will be always against this justify content property. So if our justify content is arranging our items horizontally, then the align items property will arrange our items vertically in an opposite way. And if justify content is arranging and laying out our items vertically, then the align items will be aligning our items horizontally, which means that it will always be the opposite of justify content. So now justify content will follow the direction of the flex direction, which means that if it is a row, it will go horizontally because the rows are always going horizontally. And align items, in this case, it will go vertically because that is the opposite of justify content. So if justify content goes horizontally, then it will go vertically, and if justify content go vertically, then it will go horizontally. So this was the most confusing part of the FlexBox, and if you got this, then congratulations, you just knocked out the most complex part of the CSS FlexBox. So the rest of the lesson will be very self-explanatory. So now let's see what this does for us. Actually, now that our justify content aligned our items horizontally, now we know that align items will do the job for us vertically. For example, if we give it very simple, let's keep it simple and give it a center value, you can see that it aligns our items vertically. Now it is vertically in the center, and that was what the align items did for us. And for example, if we give it a flex start or flex end, let's give it flex end, you can see that it arranged our items vertically. Now it is in the end of our flex container vertically, but horizontally it is still in the center. You can see that it has evenly spaced around the items. Or we can give it flex start. You can see that now it is in the top of our container. And also the default value for this is the stretch, as you saw before. So this is the stretch that we can give it if we want. So this was about justify content and align items properties. So now let's change this flex direction to column. For example, let's remove this justify content and align items properties. Now we have our standard FlexBox, but now we want to have a column-based FlexBox. You can see that now it is in the column-based. Now our items are in the top of each other, which means that they will go vertically. So now, as we discussed, justify content will always go the same direction as this flex direction goes. So now that our flex direction is column, which means that it will go vertically, the justify content will arrange our items vertically because it always follows the flex direction. So for example, if I give it now justify content and make a center, you can see that now it is vertically in the center, but before it was justifying our items horizontally. On that time our flex direction was row, and if I give it, for example, flex end, it will be in the end. And if we, for example, give it space between, you can see that now it is adding a space between our items, but in a column based, or space around. Oops. So it is a space around. And now the align items property will arrange our items horizontally because it is always the opposite of justify content. Now justify content arranges our items vertically, so align items will do the same thing but horizontally. So let's see align items and let's give it center. You can see that now it centers our items horizontally. So these were justify content and align item properties, but we also have another property to lay out our items inside this container, and that is the align content property. Well, that's not a very important property, but it is in the FlexBox and I want to mention that too. So let's remove this. Now we have a FlexBox, a row-based FlexBox. So the align content property, actually it's not used to lay out the single row container or single row items inside the container. As you can see, this is a single row inside this container. To see it better, we should just duplicate some of these children elements. So now you can see that we have 5 flex items inside our container. So we need to have more rows inside this container, but if I, for example, decrease the size, shrink the size of this browser, you can see that our items do not wrap in a new line. They don't go to the new line. They just scale down their size to fit in this window or this container. So this is the problem. So we need 2 or more than 2 rows inside this container, but our items are not going to the new line. So therefore we won't have the next row. So this is when the flex wrap property comes in. So we have the flex wrap property, and this is for letting the items to whether wrap or not wrap inside this container. So if we set it to wrap right now, you can see that any of these items which do not fit inside this container, inside this row rather, it will go to the new line. And if I now scale down this browser, you can see that more items will go to the new line because there is not enough space for them. You can see if we expand our browser, so they will go to their initial positions in the left side of the container. So this is the flex wrap property. So let's shrink it a bit. So now you can see that we have 2 rows inside our container. And by the way, I want to mention another property because it is the appropriate time for that, and that is the gap property. You can see that now our items are sticking to each other. They have no space between themselves. So therefore we have another property in the FlexBox, which is gap property, and it will add some spaces between our flex items. For example, if we give it 10 pixels, you can see that it separates our items 10 pixels. So now we have our items and our FlexBox. We have 2 rows. So now let's talk about the align content property. And the align content property is used to align or arrange multiple rows inside a container all together. So for example, we have 2 rows, and now in order to change the position of these rows all together without changing the spaces of rows individually. We want to move them, for example, all together in somewhere inside this container. We can use the align content property, and for example we can give it flex end. So you can see that it moved all of the items all together to the bottom of this container. And if we give it flex start, you can see that it moves all of the items all together, or all of the rows all together. So this was about aligning our items inside our container. So now we know how to play with the position of our flex items inside this container. Now let's remove all of these extra styles. Now we have our standard FlexBox. Actually, let's remove these two last children too. We don't need them anymore. So you can see that now we have our standard flex items. So let's expand our browser too. So you can see that this is the default style of the flex items when we change their container to a FlexBox container, and we learned how to control them from inside of this container. We can play with their positions, we can lay out them differently, we can give them spaces. But all of the things that we have done so far, we were just writing the properties inside this container, which is the FlexBox container. But actually, for overriding this or for changing these styles individually for these child tags or the flex items, we can actually add some specific styles for them individually, not from the container. For example, let's say that we want this first flex item to be different. We don't want it to have a stretch value in its align items. So you can see that it is by default a stretch in the align items, but I can override it. For example, I can write align self, because this is the flex item itself. It is not the container, which we write a single property and it will be set for all of the items. We are setting it, or we are changing it individually, and I can just set it to flex start, for example. You can see that now only our first child is and the start of our flex container. And also if we select, for example, the second flex item, and let's say that we want this to be align self of center, so it will be in the center of our container. And just like this, we can select our third flex item and we can align it to end, so align self flex end. You can see that we changed each item individually. So now let's remove these values so that we have our standard FlexBox. So now let's talk about other properties that we can use for our flex items individually. You can see that now if I shrink my browser, you can see that by default our flex items scale down and they shrink all together to fit in this window. But if we want to prevent this behavior for any of these flex items, we can easily do that. For example, in the first flex item, I just need to use flex shrink. This flex shrink is the property that is for shrinking the flex items, so if we can control the shrinking of our flex items. And if we set it to 0, you can see that the first flex item didn't shrink, so the rest of flex items, they shrinked all together, but this flex item didn't. If we expand our browser, for example, now, you can see that it stays in its original size. And if we shrink the browser, these two items will shrink, but it will not. So this is the flex shrink property. And the opposite of this property is flex grow property. So let me clear this flex shrink. So we have, and also let's expand our browser. You can see that this flex container has an extra space in the right side. So if we want to fill out this extra space using any of these flex items, so we can use the flex grow property. So let's say that we want this third flex item gain all of this extra space or leftover space in the right side. So if we come here in the third flex item, we can use the flex grow property and set it, for example, to 1. you can see that it fills out all of the remaining available space. So if we expand our browser, it will always get the extra space. Alright, this was all about FlexBox in the CSS. Now I hope that you can use FlexBox confidently in your projects, and I hope that this video will help you. If it did, so give it a like, share it to your friends so that they use this video too, and hit the subscribe button to watch more videos just like this one. Thank you very much for watching and have a nice day.